So the standard models for prehistoric societies, if you ask most people what they think of when they think of sort of prehistoric men, you know, back in the time of sort of the cavemen, as people would say, they think of hunter-gatherer groups. We have a section of the tribe, and I'm going to basically be using the term tribe and group and sort of clan interchangeably. Most likely use the word tribe more often than not. I do realize that there's a specific number usually associated with that in the size of group. I'm not being that technical in this situation, so please just accept my word tribe for this time being. So when you have the division of labor, you usually have a group of the tribe going out to hunt for meat. The classical sort of cave paintings of that involves, you know, men with spears taking down the woolly mammoth. And then you have another group from the tribe that are foragers. And they're looking for things like fruits, vegetables, grains, eggs. In some cases, they might have found small animals that might have been easier to catch or might have been hibernating if it was winter. And together, those two groups basically provided the nourishment for four of the groups. Now, the thing to remember about hunting-gathering societies is that they are by necessity migratory. A hunting-gathering group must obviously follow the large animals, and most large animals will migrate to, you know, supplement their own diets. So we're really dealing with a group that doesn't have a consistent locale. Now, the most common idea of the hunter-gathering society is that the division of labor was done across gender lines. So the men were the hunters, the females and the women were the foragers. And I'm going to come back to this point later on, but there may actually be significant evidence to suggest that this isn't the case. So that's sort of how the tribe looks. So how does the tribe mate? How do they continue on sort of the human line? Well, there's two accepted models, and both of them feature monogamy fairly strongly. The first accepted model, and this is the one that's particularly enjoyed by most major religions, is the idea of the monogamous pair bond. So you have the male and the female together producing an offspring and caring for the offspring together, and more specifically, you have the male and the female who are constantly on guard for each other's infidelity. The men because they're concerned with paternity, and the women because they're concerned with their own offspring having the maximum resources. The other model for this is for prehistoric man is the alpha male with a harem of females, something following along the lines of gorillas and a lot of chimp societies. So what you have is you have the alpha male, who's the all-powerful hunter, who has all of the women as his mates, and then you have sort of the subordinate males who don't have access to mates and are basically expected to sort of stay back. Now, probably the subordinate males aren't necessarily okay with that because obviously they want to get their rocks off too. So what you actually have is what is the actually appropriate term. This is the term that scientists use. It's called the sneaky fucker. I love that term. The sneaky fucker. And quite literally what they do is they sneak a fuck. So what they're doing is basically, in gorilla societies, they will basically take the female, lure her away from the group, either by, for example, showing her an area where there's food or something along those lines. And then once she's far enough away that her copulatory vocalizations or screams of pleasure, we would assume, can't be heard, that's when he will, sneak his fuck. And then in that way, when she rejoins the group, she's carrying his child as opposed to the child of the alpha male. However, the alpha male is still providing resources to this child because he assumes that it's his. So I quite enjoy that term, sneaky fucker, and I really wish we had the opportunity to say it more often. So the standard mating script, and this script is actually still applicable today. I mean, if you were to ask most people to describe the script for modern relationships, you'd get something similar. And you basically start off with boy meets girl. And when boy meets girl, boy evaluates girl for for fertility based on visual cues. So, I mean, we've all read the Cosmo and the Men's Health magazines, right? What are the cues of fertility? You have the breast to hip ratio. We've all heard the jokes about, childbearing hips. You have the lustrous hair. You have the clear skin, the youth. Basically, all evidence of health and fertility. And then, from the female's point of view, she's evaluating her mate for signs of access to resources. So in modern society, this is access to wealth. We all talk about, that girl who's looking for the rich husband. And once they've both been reasonably satisfied that the person that they have met is acceptably fertile and acceptably wealthy, you have the mating. So boy and girl mate. And then once they've mated, the male, or the boy, is on guard for female infidelity. Obviously the reason here is because he wants to guarantee that this offspring to whom he's going to be providing his resources is actually his, that he, to guarantee paternity. And then you have the female who's on guard for male infertility because she wants to make sure that all of his resources are going to be going to her offspring and not spread across several different ones. However, the male is also looking for opportunities to actually spread his seed. We always have that fun sort of words that are being said, why are men promiscuous? Why do men cheat? Because they need to spread their seed. And, this is supposed to be proof of the evolutionary monogamous/non-monogamous male model. And then you have the women who, once they're ovulating, are looking for a more alpha male to provide better genetic sperm. So, what are the implications of this model? The implications of this assumed social structure are a higher libido in males than in females. Now, this might not seem self-evident from what I've said, but I'm going to basically put forth the idea here. The reason this would imply a higher libido in males rather than females is because males have that imperative to try to spread out their genetic material across several women because they want to guarantee the maximum amount of offsprings. The women, on the other hand, they have more to lose if the male discovers their infidelity. Because they, for example, the male with the access to resources finds out that she was unfaithful after she's already pregnant, then all of a sudden she's a single mother on the savannah. And that's not necessarily a good situation to be in. Especially, if we think about the vulnerability inherent in pregnancy and in birth. There's a good period of time when the women themselves would not have been able to go out to forage or have access to meat. So we have the situation in which, the men want to go out and have as much sex as they can, and the women only really want to have sex when they're ovulating. So the implication of this model is an adversarial relationships between males and females. I mean, if you're convinced that your partner is going to cheat on you the moment you turn on your back, chances are there's not a lot of trust there. And again, especially with the females, there's a lot of vulnerability inherent in pregnancy. So if you're sort of in a monogamous model where you're sort of on guard for male infidelity, then you're going to definitely feel that vulnerability quite a bit more. Moreover, actually, if for whatever reason the male you have mated with dies or gets sick or loses his access to resources, then you're a lot more vulnerable. So the other implication of this model is sex for reproduction only. Now, the reason this would be is because if you want to guarantee paternity, you've got to make sure you're keeping an eye on your fertile mate while she's ovulating. But you have to know when that is. So, and you want to make sure that basically every time you're having sex, that you're pretty much guaranteeing that you're impregnating her. The other focus of this, though, would be a very heteronormative idea of human relationships. Because if sex is for recreation only, well then gay sex really doesn't make a lot of sense, does it? Because you're basically wasting your genetic material at that point. And this is an argument that's really popular with Christian fundamentalists. And this is why these specific models of social hierarchy are very, very popular with them when they're talking about why homosexuality is wrong, because, well, clearly there's no evolutionary basis for it. My model will show otherwise. So resource sharing is limited to family units. I mean, obviously, if the female is giving away her sexual resources to anyone, then there's no there's no goal for the man, who's questioning paternity to share his resources with her. But vice versa, if he's basically just sharing the meat with anyone, whether or not they're sleeping with him, well then what's really to convince the female that she should mate with him, since she's going to get the meat anyway, right? So it's very, dependent on that sort of mutual sharing of resources. But it would also mean that the resources are only shared with the family unit. Again, the implications of this is the hunting and gathering is divided along gender lines, and with that meat is the primary resource. The reason for this is the resource the man has to share has to be significant enough, and if it is significant enough, well, if he's the one providing the meat, well, then that has to be the most significant resource. And the reason it have to be, again, around gender lines is because we have to basically have a system in which men are able to provide something that women aren't. So, and then this model puts the focus of survival on the individual and the individual's genes as opposed to the survival of the tribe as a whole. So now I want to basically evaluate what the flaws of this model are. Because I mentioned why they're explained that way, but what are the flaws of it? So, gender disparity in libido. There's a lot of people here who probably think this is something that exists. It doesn't. The psychological studies that have been done, and even the physiological studies that have been done, have been conclusively able to show that if you eliminate the social pressures that we have, female and male libido are equal. In fact, female libido may even to some extent exceed that of males. The reason we see in our society a situation where we have women having a lower libido than men more often than not is more due to social pressures than anything else. After all, if you're a girl who sleeps around, what do they call you? Slut, whore, tramp, prostitute, night walker. They're not very positive, are they? The conception of, the idea that we have as a society of a woman who's sexually active isn't a positive one. As this is changing, slowly, but it is changing to some extent, we're seeing more evidence of women who are becoming more in control of their sexuality. Moreover, if you actually look at areas, at groups where female sexuality is encouraged, and I'm actually going to bring to the example of swingers clubs, you actually find that the female libido actually really picks up at that moment. One of the big sort of jokes that goes around swingers clubs is that the first meeting, it's usually the husband dragging the wife. Every subsequent meeting after that, it's the wife dragging the husband. And the reason for that is because swingers clubs create such a safe environment for women because they want to make sure that they can actually bring more women into it because they are an integral part of swingers clubs, obviously, that a woman can actually be fully in control of her sexuality, can be every bit as sexual as she wants to be, and she can get off on the power of that without any social consequences. That means nobody from the group who has seen her that sexual is going to turn around and call her a slut. Nobody is going to assume that they can make free with her body simply because she's a sexual person. So, the adversarial interaction between genders. This ties in as well with the lower libido idea. We have this concept of the ball and chain. Well, if you get married, there's going to be a ball and chain because you're never going to be able to have sex once you're married because your wife's going to turn into a frigid bitch and you're just going to be alone and sexless for the rest of your life. And that pretty much is the concept of marriage that we have in modern society. Not very romantic, is it? So then we have intercourse for reproduction only. Now, this is obviously not the case. I'm going to take a risk here, and I'm going to say that probably the majority of you here, if you have been sexually active for reasons other than reproduction. Am I right? Sex is fun. And it serves a lot more purposes than just reproduction. And in recent studies where they asked people for reasons about why they had sex, love was a reason. Friendship was a reason. Self-esteem, stress relief, pain relief was a reason. By the way, sex as pain relief works brilliantly. I know this from experience having arthritis. So there's a lot of different reasons why people have sex other than just reproduction only. So then the gender division of tasks. I mentioned that I'd get back to this. In a hunting-gathering society, it's really beneficial. You want to make sure that the people doing the tasks are the people the best suited for the tasks. So, if you have a guy who is more likely to trip over his feet and stab himself with a spear than ever actually hit a mammoth with it, but can tell the difference of the different types of leaves between the berry that's going to kill you and the berry that's, going to make you feel really good, what are the chances that you're going to have him being the hunter? Probably not very high. Now, conversely, what if you have a woman who can't tell the difference between the blueberry that's going to kill you and the red berry that's not, and that's safe to eat? You probably don't want her being the forager. But that girl can hit she can throw a spear with deadly accuracy. Chances are you want her being the hunter instead. So when the survival of your tribe really depends on the skill of its members being able to perform their tasks, do you really think that they're going to care whether you dangle or squat when you pee based on what they're going to let you do? Probably not.
But if I can ask a question.
Sure. There are questions. There's questions at the end, but I'm going to guess what your question is, if I can. Wouldn't you say that males are more suited to hunting based on their strength, whereas women are more suited to hunting based on their ability to detect patterns in color? Am I right?
That was it, but yeah.
Oh, okay. That wasn't it? Okay. Do people are wondering about that, just out of curiosity?
Yeah, sure.
Well, I mean, the idea of sort of strength, there's a lot more involved in hunting than just strength. A lot of it, too, can be guile. I mean, as a species, we're pretty weak in comparison to something like a woolly mammoth. It's really ingenuity and sort of ability with aim, accuracy, and things like that, which we actually find that there's not a lot of distinction between gender lines. So yes, would males have probably made up the majority of the hunters? Yes. Would they have been the only ones hunting? No. And same with females. And this might even tie into sort of the idea of, and I don't want to be too stereotypical, but we do have, for example, that idea of, gay men being great in fashion. Well, what's fashion? Fashion is color and patterns. So, perhaps in prehistoric society, the homosexual males were actually more the foragers because colors and patterns play a very important role in determining foraging, what kind of food you can eat. So then meat is the primary resource. I like meat. Don't get me wrong. I would love a steak right now. But it probably would not have been the primary resource. The reason for it is hunting is difficult. You can't guarantee success on every single hunt. Which means the food that's being brought in through foraging is just as important as the meat. More likely what we had was more of a distribution according to the seasons. Which means that in summer, when it was very difficult to see the animals because they were able to take cover in various different planes and plants, it was the plant material that really made up the majority of the food. However, in winter times, when there was less plant matter, obviously by necessity, that's probably when meat made up the majority of it. So the hunters and the foragers were equally as important to the survival of the whole. Resources sharing to family units. Now, this is probably the biggest problem that I have with the monogamy models, because this really assumes a very small tribe. Now, if you're basically focused on hunting and foraging, then you really can't afford to just have you, your wife, and your 3 kids. Because while she's pregnant and while she's watching the kids, she's not doing a lot of foraging, and chances are you're too exhausted to hunt. Not only that, but if you're trying to bring down a big prey, you're not going to be able to do that by yourself, which means you need a big network. Now, if you have a big network of people, what are the chances that they're going to be okay with you, taking the deer that you hunted together and just giving it to your family? Probably not very happy. I'll give you another example. Let's say that you and your children go on, with their school, go on a field trip, and you somehow end up on a desert island. And it's maybe 3 parents and a bunch of kids. How okay do you think the kids, and even yourself, are going to be to go out, find a deer, find meat, and only share it with your child? Probably not very okay. You're probably going to feel the need to share that resource with everybody to ensure the survival of the whole. Same idea. If you see the other parent finding water and just sharing it with their kids, you're probably going to throw a fit. So why do we assume that we are better sharers when we've actually created this idea of resources for the individual than our ancestors who actually depended on the sharing for their survival? So here we have survival of the individual versus survival of the tribe. The individual in prehistoric society was probably not important. What was important was the survival of the tribe as a whole, because when the tribe survives, the individual thrives. The reason for this being is, if you focus on the survival of the individual and you break your leg, you're fucked. But if the tribe is there and they're caring for everybody, then they might be able to take the time for you to heal your leg and still support you, on the understanding that you'll be able to support them if they're sick. Okay, so here's getting to my new model. And sorry about the, the very long introduction to the old model, but I find you always have to disprove the old models before you can really start proving your own. So, I'm proposing a model that's closer to the bonobo idea. How many of you here have seen the movie The Ugly Truth? Wow, okay, like 2 people. Great. Alright. Well, the idea in there is you have a guy who's doing sort of a sex/relationship advice show, and he loves talking about the bonobos because in bonobo societies, you have the females increasing bonding through mutual oral sex. Now, a lot of straight guys, are probably liking the idea of regular girl-on-girl shows. Or at least, the straight guys in the audience probably would appreciate something along those lines. So, but there is a reason why they did this, and the reason is to basically encourage communal bonding. So, what you had is, rather than sex for procreation, you had sex in order to increase bonding of the tribe. So, you would have people performing oral sex as a hello. Hey, good morning. Here's some oral sex. That's a fairly good idea. Not only that, but the females would have basically kept the males interested in continuing to provide for all of them by making sure that they were happy and constantly had sex. And the women too. The female pleasure would have been very important in this idea. So obviously, if you're sleeping around with everyone, you're not really going to have certainty when it comes to paternity. But I don't think, and there are scientists who are starting to agree with me, that paternity was an issue. And I'm going to explain why later. I'm going to explain why now. Paternity is not an issue, because if you're sleeping with everyone, even if she's sleeping with everybody else, chances are at least one of the women is carrying your offspring. Yes, you can't be sure which one, but it really doesn't matter, because everybody's sharing all the resources with everybody. It is a bit of a communistic model, I do understand that. I'd like to call it more socialistic than communist, but that's a political discussion for another time. But it's basically this idea that if you don't know who your offspring is, then you have a vested interest in making sure that all of the offspring survive to guarantee that yours does too. Which is a great way to really ensure the survival of the tribe as a whole. So then moving on, you have parenting responsibility shared, which is another really great aspect of this model. Rather than basically having the one woman have to care for her offspring and take care of everything, you have the responsibilities being shared with everybody. So, for example, if there's somebody who's better suited to child rearing or taking care of the children, they might stay with the offspring while the rest of the women go out to do foraging and hunting, and the men as well. So where's the evidence? We're the Ottawa Skeptics here, right? That's what we care about. We care about evidence. Where's the evidence of this kind of model? The evidence is in biology, and I will talk about each of these issues in detail. The evidence is in neuroscience. The evidence is in psychology, in sociology, and even in history and anthropology. So let's start off with biology. Oxytocin intercourse link. We've all heard about sort of oxytocin, the bonding hormone, right? It's the hormone that's produced after sex. It's the one that makes you want to cuddle. Well, this actually happens with sex, regardless of whether it's penis and vagina intercourse or other forms of sex, like oral sex, anal sex, even just petting, cuddling. This is a hormone that's produced the more often you have sex of any kind. So why do we have a bonding hormone being produced if sex was a rare occurrence? That doesn't make a lot of sense. Now, why don't we turn that around? What if we're having sex a lot? Then a bonding hormone makes sense, because then every time you're having sex, you're strengthening the bond between the tribe, and you're strengthening how invested the tribe is to everybody else's survival. The estrous cycle. Like I mentioned before, the monogamy model posits the idea of sex for reproduction only. Now, if you're having sex for reproduction, you have to know when the female is ovulating. Human beings, as primates, are one of the group of primates that has the least amount of obvious cues when a female is ovulating. Just Quick show of hands. How many people here think I'm ovulating right now? You don't know. And there's no way for you to know without, technology that probably didn't exist back in, how many years BC. So if you don't have that clue, you can't know when you're ovulating. So you can't know which sex act is actually going to involve offspring. Female and male anatomy. I find this to be a really great example of how we're really built as sexual animals, and frequent sex animals. The clitoris. The clitoris is the only organ in the human body whose only purpose, whose only function is pleasure. That is the only purpose of the clitoris. Isn't that fantastic? We have an organ that all it exists for is to make you feel really, really good. That's great. Not only that, but the clitoris actually exists outside of the vaginal canal, which means it is actually not reached through most cases of intercourse, or specifically penis and vagina intercourse. In fact, I'm going to kind of shock the men here a little bit. 70% of women cannot orgasm through intercourse alone. How many guys here knew that? More than most. I like it. Mind you, at least a couple of you I've told this to before, so it's not cheating. So, think of that. If any of you here have dated 7 women, and you think that dated 10 women, and you think that all 10 of them got off from every case of intercourse, hate to break it to you, you're not that lucky. Heck, if you've dated more than one woman, chances are you're not that lucky. So what about the 30% who can intercourse from penis and vagina intercourse? Are they just built better? No. For 10% of them, they're actually using positions in which they're actually able to stimulate their clitoris through certain positions by grinding it up against their partner's pelvic bone. 10 to 14% actually have an erogenous zone or a highly erogenous zone in another part of their body. There was actually a test case of a woman who could orgasm just through rubbing her eyebrow. There was another one actually who got off through brushing her teeth. You'd think she'd have amazing oral hygiene, wouldn't you? But no, apparently she thought she was possessed by demons and so switched to mouthwash. People are weird. But yeah, and then the other 10%, or it's a little bit less than 10%, but the other sort of between 7 and 10% are actually women who have the capability to think themselves off, to think themselves to orgasm, which is a great talent to have. But still, intercourse is not actually where women get their pleasure. They get it through clitoral stimulation. In fact, a lot of the studies about the female G-spot are actually now positing that the G-spot is actually just the back of the clitoris in certain women where it can actually press up against the back. And it doesn't actually exist in the vagina itself. It's actually just reached through the vagina. So multiple orgasms. If you're living in a society where you're really only having sex for procreation, then you probably don't need multiple orgasms. So why would you need multiple orgasms unless you're having a lot of sex? What makes it even more interesting is that when it comes to women, each orgasm makes every successive orgasm more likely and more powerful, which means that the female body is actually built to have as much sex for as long as possible. Because as she continues to have sex, her pleasure just increases. Yes, there is a plateau for a lot of women. At one point, it just stops being pleasure, just starts being so much pleasure it's pain. But yeah, you can continue having, multiple orgasms. So, alternately, in men, you have a refractory period. This is going to come as a shock to a lot of you, but the average refractory period for men is something close to about 24 hours, which means really most men can, and this is broken out around age groups, so you have obviously the extreme of the older men whose refractory period is a lot longer, and the other extreme of young men where the refractory period is a lot shorter, but on average it's about 24 hours, so it's about 1 orgasm per day. So, you're built to have 1 orgasm per day, and she's built to have multiple per day. What does this suggest to you? Suggests that she's probably having sex with more than just one person per day. I mean, I think that that's pretty good evidence right there just in our anatomy. Especially if you consider that the average time of male ejaculation during intercourse is something like 15 minutes, and that's actually overestimating. So that's something to consider right there. So the other actually evolutionary evidence for a polyamorous model is actually testicle size. There's a correlation, or I should say rather a reverse correlation, between testicle size and the fidelity of your females. The smaller your testicles, the more faithful your females. The larger your testicles, the less faithful your females. Human beings, you guys, your balls are pretty big. At least compared to other primates, your balls are pretty big. At least in comparison to the rest of your size. But if it makes you feel any better, you're also the primate that has the largest penis out of any other ones. So there you go. Now you can feel a lot better because yours is much bigger than a chimp's or a gorilla's. Alright, so neuroscience, psychology. I'm combining those two because the first point actually falls into both of those genres. So, the language brain. If you ask people what separates the human animal from the rest of animals, you'll probably say the large brain. You know, we have the ability for metacognition, we have a very, very complex language system. And the large brain is actually tied in to that language system. Our ability to communicate in our very complex language basically led to the expansion of our brain, and we have a very large language section of the brain. Now, there's actually significant evidence that the more social an animal, the larger their language brain. If you, for example, compare chimps and bonobos, which are two closest relatives in the primate kingdom, the bonobos, who have that very great social interaction, you have the girl-on-girl action being constant, their language brain is much bigger, significantly bigger than that of chimps, and is actually a lot closer to that of human beings than to that of chimps. And then you have other social animals. The more social the animal is, the more evidence of language you have. I mean, look at big cats, ignoring the lion because they're actually the only large cat that has a social group, versus wolves. If you were to think of their communication, chances are that you're able to see a lot more communication in wolves, which is a social animal, than you can in large cats, which is a solitary animal. And this is pretty consistent. The more social an animal, the bigger social groups they exist in, the larger their language capacity. So then, from psychology specifically, let's look at some of the, one of the most common complaints in marriage. I actually took a class with somebody who did marital counseling, and the most common complaint was libido differences. Now, I know I mentioned libido differences in the monogamy model, but that one posited basically female lower libido and male higher libido. What marital counselors are finding is that the division isn't actually that clear along the genders. So you're just as likely to get a male with a lower libido and a female with a higher libido as you are to get a male with a higher libido and a female with a lower libido. But if you're basically coming from a social structure, a prehistoric social structure where the instinct was to have sex with as many different people as possible, then it suddenly makes sense why you might have this division of libido in relationships. I mean, perhaps you came from some of the animals who maybe didn't participate as much in the free sex. Or maybe you came from the, from the ancestors who were very, sexually active. Now, I don't think it's quite that clear-cut genetically, but there is a certain amount of, I think, correlation, or at least idea behind this idea that if we were instinctually polyamorous in our biology for the most part of our history, then suddenly being forced to tie yourself to one partner makes it a little bit more difficult. So then, evidence from sociology. Marital infidelity. In a recent study that was done, they found that 64% of couples were unfaithful in marriage. 64%. That means the majority of couples were sexually unfaithful to their partners. And the division along gender lines wasn't as clear-cut. If you corrected for social pressure, there was very little difference between the genders. So you have basically a community, or you have a society that's saying, monogamy is the key, monogamy is natural, and monogamy is what we're built for, but the evidence doesn't point that way. The majority of our marriages are unfaithful. We're physically unable to be monogamous. Or at least that's what the studies seem to be showing. Not only that, but even those of us who do succeed in monogamy aren't actually practicing monogamy. We're practicing serial monogamy. Very few people will have only one partner for their entire life. They may have one partner for a very big chunk of it. But most people probably dated at some point, and if they dated, they probably engaged in premarital sex or some form of sexual contact. So, we're not even monogamous when we think we're good at it. Porn and erotica consumption. Most men and many women consume porn or erotica. Now, I say many women because there is actually very strong social pressure discouraging women from actually consuming pornography. And a lot of women won't admit to that what they're reading is actually erotica. Hate to break it to you, 50 Shades of Grey, no matter how badly it's written, is erotica. And it's written really badly. But even if we're being monogamous to our partners, we're still looking for visual stimulation of some other kind. Be it through pornography, or being it through the visuals we get in our own heads when we're imagining what's going on in the erotica that we're reading. So we're constantly searching for other stimulation. History and anthropology. So I know that most of my talk has been pretty Western-centric. I apologize for that. Most of the studies I have access to are pretty Western-centric in themselves. However, there's actually a lot of evidence of tribes where there's a lot less sort of Western influence and social influence that actually show a lot of evidence of polyamory within their groups. The Amazon, in particular, has a lot of tribes in which women are actually encouraged to sleep with as many different people as possible. In fact, they have the concept of being a little bit pregnant. So you know that commercial actually, it says, you can't, how do you know if you're just a little bit pregnant, or you can't be just a little bit pregnant? And things like that. And well, in this one, they actually do have women who are a little bit pregnant. The way they understand reproduction is that every instant of sexual intercourse causes a fetus to slowly build until the point where it's big enough that she's actually pregnant. So basically, you can sort of imagine this as a kind of a lump of sperm and semen that is basically building until eventually becomes a ball that's big enough to qualify as a fetus. So you think at that point she'd stop having sex, right? No. If she's a responsible woman and a responsible mother in that tribe, she will actually continue to have sex. The reason for it being is that she will have sex with various different good members of her society. So she'll have sex with the best storyteller in the tribe so that her offspring will absorb the essence of a good storyteller. She will have sex with the best hunter so that potentially her child is the best hunter. She'll have sex with the most wealthy man so that maybe that offspring will have, you know, a better concept of business. And it's basically that idea. They don't think that there's one father. They think that there's multiple fathers in the tribe, and that every one person has multiple fathers. The Ashe, in particular, actually, are known for this. When anthropologists went in, they were known to ask children, who's your father? And a lot of children were very confused by this concept because they were implying a singular father. And a lot of them were like, well, no, I have many fathers. You know, Chief A is my father. Hunter B is my father. Storyteller C is also my father. They're all my fathers because they all helped my mother build me. There's actually other tribes. This is a little bit off the topic, but there's other tribes actually where it's considered appropriate for young men to perform oral sex on the men of the tribe because in doing so they'll be able to absorb the essence of manhood. That every time that they swallowed semen, they were actually becoming more men. And then eventually, you know, when they became bursting full of maleness, and they were actually men, then they would have to share their maleness with the young boys in the tribe. And it just goes to show you that basically what we consider normal sex isn't actually something that's definitive. It's not something that's normal. There's no such thing as normal sex on a global scale. It changes from group to group to group. Celtic tribes. We consider paternity being so important. Well, in a lot of Celtic tribes, your heir wasn't actually your child. Even if you could guarantee that your wife was completely faithful to you, your son was not your heir. Your sister's son was your heir. And that's because you can never guarantee 100% who the father of a child is. But you can pretty damn well guarantee who the mother is. Not only that, but in a lot of cases, they had fostering of children. So basically, once the child was old enough, you'd give the child over to another family. And your foster family was just as important, and in some cases more important, than your blood family. your milk brother. You know, you had people who would actually consider each other family based on the fact that they suckled from the same woman. So, if the concept of monogamy and the concept of paternity and paternity genetics being so important is so self-evident, then why do we have so many examples of tribes where it's not? So, usually when we talk about prehistoric man, we're comparing them to chimps. Bonobos are also chimps, but I'm talking about sort of the classic idea of chimps when people think of chimp. So, you know, like Coco and all those examples of chimps. There have been situations, actually, where the alpha males in a group of, in a sort of a band of chimps end up dying off. I think the example that I'm actually thinking of, they ended up eating from a dump where there was a lot of toxic material. And the alpha males died off. And we had a very unique case in this situation because what actually formed was a matriarchal chimp tribe. Because the females of the group banded together and basically kept the males under control. And the subordinate males basically had to, you know, work with the females. So you had a lot less, actually, violence and abuse. And a lot of these tribes ended up being a lot more successful because they worked together a lot better. Chimps, as you may know, are very aggressive. Well, these chimps who lived in these tribes actually ended up being a lot less aggressive. And don't necessarily quote me on this because I do have to double check my source. However, I do believe that they had instances where other males were actually joining into the tribe and they actually lived and continued to live under the matriarchal social system rather than trying to impose themselves as the alpha male. And the reason for it being is that a lot of the males were a lot happier because with this matriarchal idea, one of the ways that they were actually reinforcing it was through frequent sexual contact. So why does this matter? Why does it matter whether our ancestors were monogamous or polyamorous? Well, one of the reasons it matters is because we have a very strong rape culture in Western society. I'd say in Eastern as well, but I don't know enough about Eastern society to be able to say that. But if I'm thinking at least of the Middle East, then I'd say they have a pretty good one too. And one of the fundamental ideas in rape culture is that women have the lower libido and are the guards of sexual purity, and that males can't help themselves. Well, that kind of idea really only works with a monogamous model. But now if we don't have a monogamous model, if we have a model instead that says that males and females were equally sexual, well then all of a sudden the males have to take responsibility. They have to take responsibility for the fact that if she says no, it means no. And you can damn well control yourself. Females as property. This is actually the reason monogamy came about after civilization started. So ironically enough, civilization is often being credited as a female invention because since, you know, the majority of females were gatherers, then, you know, one of them discovered that the place where she spilt the grains, the same plant would grow the next year, and then all of a sudden they started planting, and you had agriculture led to civilization, etc. So once you had agriculture and civilization, you had the concept of property. And once you have the concept of property, you have the concept of inheritance. And at that moment, paternity becomes important. So how do you guarantee paternity? By making sure your woman has no access to any other man. And how do you do that? Well, at that point, she's property. So the monogamy model is really a reinforcement of this idea of females as property, or at least as the only worth that females have is in our ability to bear children. Which actually kind of means that women are in part responsible for creating the social structure that ultimately led to our enslavement, which is kind of really messed up if you think about it. Another reason why the monogamy model is so dangerous is because it leads to the suppression of sexuality. If you look at a lot of the major religions that exist out there, the main thing that they all have in common is sex is bad unless. Sex is bad unless you meet these special criteria. Once you meet these special, very strict criteria, then sex is okay, but only if you don't enjoy it. So we're basically being told over and over again that the most natural feeling that exists is wrong. Having sex is wrong, it's bad, it's dirty. ew, the vagina, ew, it smells. We create this idea of sex as being a bad thing. And that also leads to some really big problems in our society. I mean, look at the ultimate example of sexual suppression. Catholic priests. What is a big problem that Catholic priests are having a problem with right now? Yeah, exactly. It's pedophilia. If you suppress sexuality, your body and your mind is just going to rebel against it. Now, I think actually when it comes to priests, a lot of it has to do that people who had basically desires that were considered unnatural, that they went into something where they were expected to be celibate in the hopes that it would make it easier. However, I think that forcing somebody to be celibate also plays a big role in it. Forcing somebody to be celibate is probably going to backfire in the long run, because we are, as an animal, not meant to be celibate. The understanding of love and relationships. This is one actually that's very important to me, because one of the things that I find fairly depressing is the high levels of divorce in our society, mainly because of the impact that it has on children. Because we have this understanding of monogamy being natural and the natural state for the human animal, we have this idea that if you're in love, monogamy is easy. If you're truly in love with that person, you will never find another person attractive ever again. That's kind of bullshit. I'm sorry. But it doesn't matter how much I love my partner. If somebody else happens to have the same physical and personality characteristics that I happen to find attractive, I'm still going to find them attractive. Doesn't mean I don't love my partner. Just means I happen to find this other person attractive. But what we're actually getting is a society where you begin to doubt your love for someone if you start to find somebody else attractive, or if you start getting tempted to stray. So for some extreme examples, just the temptation to stray is considered enough to justify ending a relationship that was otherwise very successful. Not only that, but you get a situation where somebody, in a marriage that lasted 50 years, they were unfaithful once. Oh, well, it was an unsuccessful marriage. Well, why? Well, they were unfaithful, so they couldn't have really loved each other. What? It's an interesting idea. I mean, one thing that I do want to make clear is that I'm not saying that we should all go out and be polyamorous. If you want to be, that's great. If you don't want to be, that's fine too. If monogamy works for you, that's great, but you have to have an understanding of the idea that it's going to be difficult. You're going to be working against natural inclinations, which is fine. We can do that. As a species, we are fantastic at going against natural inclinations. But we have to know that we're doing it. So, some of you are probably wondering where I got a lot of my resources and information. A really great, resource is Sex at Dawn. I had a lot of what I said before. I said this just from a lot of the classes that I've taken. However, in Sex at Dawn, he actually mentions almost everything that I've said, which is pretty amazing. He's an awesome writer. I highly recommend it. Skipping Towards Gomorrah by Dan Savage is actually where I got a lot of the information regarding swingers clubs. Our Sexuality was actually a textbook that I had in my human sexual behaviors class. It didn't actually have all the information that was necessary because it was just sections of various textbooks put together. And Psych Info, which is a great resource to get a lot of great psychological studies, and you can actually limit them to being peer-reviewed, and you can look at them by various authors. The reason I didn't actually put all the various different studies that I had is because I had so many of them, it would have taken me another 20 slides in order to be able to show them. So I figured if I show the resource, you can probably find most of the studies yourself.
But when you're talking about natural inclination, what do you think about people that naturally feel jealousy towards only?
Well, it's very interesting that you mention that. There's fairly good evidence that jealousy in particular is more of a social construct than an actual biological construct. We're taught from a very young age that we're supposed to be jealous. In most children are jealous in the sense that they'll be like, no, it's mine, because you learn sort of the concept of having something. But the older you get, the less that inclination comes to light. In a lot of actually Eastern societies where it's more of a collectivistic culture rather than an individualistic culture, you actually find a lot less evidence of of jealousy. And also, if you stop seeing your mate as property, which that sounds almost insulting when I say that, but if you really examine the way we view a lot of our partners, there's very much the idea of mine. But if you stop really seeing them as property and seeing them as sort of their own person that shares their life with you, the instinct towards jealousy goes away. And the other thing, too, is actually, even where the jealousy instinct stays, more often than not, the jealousy that occurs in healthy relationships actually leads to greater sexual fulfillment. Because what actually happens is, oh, I'm watching my partner having sex with another person. Damn, suddenly I remember why they're so sexy. I want him. And it actually creates that. A lot of couples that become polyamorous actually find that it ends up reinforcing their love and their attraction to one another. Sorry, did I answer your question?
Jealousy is fear, after all.
Yes. Jealousy is ultimately the fear of losing the person that you're with. If you have an honest relationship where you're communicating with one another and you're constantly reinforcing the idea that I might find that other person attractive, I might sleep with that other person, but I'm not going to leave you because I love you, then that fear starts to disappear. Any other questions? Yes?
Sexuality seems to have two purposes. One is, of course, procreation, and the other appears to be bonding, social bonding. Now, when you're trying to raise children, as you stated, need resources, they need someone to take care of them, and the purpose of perhaps the monogamous relationship is to provide a stable relationship for children, maintain true sexual bonding. Now, the question might be, if you start bonding with other people, then that's going to lead to the bond between the couple, and not speaking the relationship that maintains the children.
So, just to summarize your question, if the importance in raising children is stability, would not a polyamorous model in which you're creating bonds with various people limit the stability towards the model that's raising the child?
That's correct.
Okay, sorry, just like I said for the microphone here. Well, again, we're talking about an idea where you're forming a bond with various different people, all of whom are helping care for the child. So it's not like, for example, a situation where I'm living just with this one guy and we're raising the child together, but every Saturday night I'm going out and I'm banging some other guy. You actually end up having a situation where you're not living with just a nuclear family. All of the various lovers are all living together and are all actually contributing. So it actually is a very stable environment because you have multiple adults all staying together consistently over a long period of time, all of whom are caring for all of the offspring together. You don't actually have the idea of just two parents. So not only that, but because you don't sort of have the fear of the one person disappearing in order to have sex with somebody else, because it's accepted and because that person stays there, you actually have a lot more stability at that point because there's not a lot of shifts and changes. The monogamy idea that we have right now, actually, where we're forced to suppress our sexuality, actually leads to a lot less stability because we have this idea that if my partner cheats on me, I have to leave him. So it causes actually a lot more divorce. Now, if we have an open, honest, non-monogamous relationship where it's like, it's okay for you to go out and, have sex with somebody else every once in a while, I'm not going to leave you because I still love you and I know you still love me, then that actually creates stability because then if something happens, if, you do go out and you meet somebody and you sleep with them, it's not going to weaken the bond between you because you've actually established that that's okay. So in a lot of situations actually where you find non-monogamy, even in Western society, those where it's, and again, I want to stress it's honest non-monogamy, so not cheating, but honestly deciding to be non-monogamous. For example, swingers couples, you actually find a lot less incidents of divorce among those couples and a lot more long-term stability.
Well, the notion of a whole bunch of different people living together is maybe happening
in our society now.
Maybe perhaps it's, for instance, very relevant to us.
Well, you know what? It still is to some extent because we've created an idea where we can't live with other people, but there is actually a growing trend towards actually triads and larger groups of families forming, actually, where you'll have, for example, one woman with two husbands, or you'll have one husband with two wives, and all of whom are actually supporting the offspring, and they stay relatively stable. Not only that, but even if you are in a polyamorous relationship where it is just the main couple living together, if you have the open and honest communication, even if you're going out and, leaving and having some time with those lovers, you're still ultimately coming back to the same home. So the stability is still reinforced because you still have this idea of ultimately coming back.
Yeah, you're trading your business. If you insist on strict monogamy and one indiscretion and that's an instability. On the other hand, another risk is that you meet someone you like better. Also, which creates instability.
Not necessarily. Sorry, I'm just going to repeat that again. You have trading risks because in the monogamous model, if you have one instant of infidelity, then you're leaving, so that's instability. But then in the polyamorous model, you might meet someone you like better and so leave. It's actually quite the opposite because in the polyamorous model, you're still allowed to be with that other person and still remain with your same partner, and you don't have to leave in order to be with that other person. Exactly, and most parents, if they're giving the option, or at least if it's parents who wanted to be parents, that's an important distinction as well. They won't actively leave their children if they don't have to. I mean, how many parents of the people here who had children because they wanted to have children? How many of you think it would have been an easy choice for you to make to just abandon your child? Probably not very easy. Yes.
It's not really a question. It's more a desire, a request for dialogue.
Okay.
Like that for me would be a gratifying endeavor is to really share different viewpoints about the ideas that were presented. I understand that Q&A is good too to get out where people might be stuck or have a specific question. But I would like the opportunity to have follow-on dialogue where people exchange ideas and what their views are and why they think the way they think. And so I'm just putting that forward as far as a way of building on knowledge and actually being able to integrate what you talked about in a more profound way and build on that.
Okay. I do believe that normally in a situation like this, eventually sort of the formalized Q&A ends, we turn off the cameras, and then basically everybody starts talking to everybody. So that will actually happen. This isn't going to be like once I stop talking, everybody has to go home, get out. It doesn't happen that way, especially not with this group.
With regards to that, we can stay as long as we like tonight. So don't feel you have to rush off.
Okay. Sorry, there's a question in the back?
Okay. I have a question that's coupled with some of your unspoken assumptions. That you're assuming that a polyamorous group will have all of their individuals in their totally acting in altruistic manner. They're all going to be bringing in the meat. They're all going to be doing it. Whereas you're portraying all monogamous relationships, like one infidelity and you're out. So I don't see, as an extreme case strategy species, we are going, I can see how a polyamorous thing will work for the males really well, but how does the females who have more parental investment in the offspring? Because they're out of commission, even if they are not, they're out of commission for 9 months.
I wouldn't say 9 months. Actually, in a lot of areas where actually agriculture is a major thing, you'll find that that women are actually usually will continue to work until they give birth. In some cases, will give birth in the field. We'll rig up a sling where they're suckling and then continue working, which I always really admire those women. But sorry, just to repeat your question, the monogamy model assumes greed and sort of hoarding behavior, whereas the non-monogamous model assumes altruism. And also, what is the advantage for a female in a polyamorous model since she still has the investment? Well, that's the main thing. The altruism isn't actually altruism just out of the goodness of your heart. I mean, the idea here is that you're still determined to have your genetic line continue, but if you don't know which of the children is your specific genetic line, you have a vested interest in making sure they all survive, so that the one that is your genetic material also survives and can go on to breed. So that's basically where the altruism comes from. Ultimately, the altruism is still, sort of, sorry, I'm trying to look for the word greed. That's not really the good word for it, but self-interest. Yeah, it's still through self-interest, but it leads basically to greater sort of sharing. And in the case of the woman, the reason it works for her is because at that point, rather than just having one male who may die at any given moment, out on the savannah, supporting her family, she has all of the males in the tribe supporting her family. So she's not left alone in the event that one male disappears. Moreover, actually, all of the females are also invested in caring for all of the children because all of the males are caring for all of the children. So you basically have this situation where instead of just sort of two people, and any given individual has a high risk of dying on the savannah, you basically have an entire group caring for it. So that actually has a lot of benefits. And not only that, but then that woman who is pregnant during the months of her being out of commission is actually supported by the entire tribe as well. So she's able to sort of have that moment of vulnerability because the parental investment comes from multiple members as opposed to just one.
But that doesn't necessarily require polyamory, because in that kind of ancient societies, you didn't have true monogamy like today. People just pair up and go off to the side. They had extended families, which were not necessarily a polyamorous relationship. There would be the uncles and the grandparents and whatever. Like the family group would still be there if the guy got killed in the savannah. It does then. They wouldn't have to have sex with the brother's wife to actually support their kid because they were still invested in that genetic line.
Not necessarily, because the primary investment would be to their own personal genetic line. I mean, yes, it's great if your nephew's line continues because then that's somebody who shares genetics with you. But when it's your own child, well, that's your own child. So it's really that idea. In the monogamy model, because paternity is specifically so important, because why else would you really care about whether or not she's monogamous?
Then how do you explain a lot of societies that still live in big family groups? Like you mentioned, in Eastern versus Western, a lot of Chinese and Indian families live with their parents and their grandparents because they do continue that whole family structure, and the grandparents care for the grandkid.
Oh, yeah.
It's not their own kid. It's like 1/16.
And that's because the instinct towards caring for the tribe remains. And that's basically where that comes from, is in prehistory, because we're talking really about how prehistory influences modern society. If prehistory was monogamous, then our instinct would be to care for the individual, which is a lot harder to break through that instinct to care for somebody else. Now, if we come from a tribal group, though, where our instinct is to care for everybody because we don't know which one's our offspring, then you actually maintain that instinct of altruism.
I think that's a key distinction is that tendency is to look at a time frame that is much shorter and measured in thousands of years, not the evolutionary process that you described to that the humans went through. So that evolutionary process, when you look at civilization of a few thousand years, as we keep referring back to it, is just a small fraction of the overall evolutionary track that we went through. So if evolutionary biology defines our pairing strategies and our survival mechanisms, they didn't just occur in the last few thousand years. They occurred over periods of tens, hundreds of thousands of years. Therefore, when our tendency, because I think it's mostly, this brings up another topic about ego and ego evolution that I think is very fascinating that addresses this, is that if we say that sex is not significant, if we don't put all that meaning in terms of our identity into sex, and it's not significant in this heavy-weighted thing, then when we have sex with other people, it's not the threat that we ascribe to it and therefore react to. So that's pretty much, I just wanted to make that it becomes very easy to kind of like look at what we think is the complete track of our evolutionary past as a few thousand years.
Because I'm just trying to figure out why monogamy keeps appearing with widely geographically dispersed populations if it was not a viable strategy.
I can actually explain that. Thank you. So why does monogamy appear over various different geographical stretches if it's not one that's if it's not an idea that came in prehistory? And the answer for that is actually what I mentioned before. It's the concept of civilization and property. If you look at a lot of the hunter-gatherer migratory tribes that still exist, you'll actually find that those ones tend to be on average more polyamorous because there is no concept of property. Once you introduce the concept of property, which you get only through agriculture and civilization, then all of a sudden there's a vested, there's the idea of inheritance, and there's that vested interest in making sure that it's only your child and only your genetic and only your family that gets the continuing resources. So that's why we see it, because the idea of agriculture was spread over geographically. I mean, in China, they still have agriculture. In Canada, they have agriculture. In Europe, they have agriculture. Because agriculture spreads, monogamy spreads, because monogamy is the obvious sort of child or offspring of agriculture.
So what then? So I guess monogamy is we're going to have property. As long as we're going to have property, monogamy seems to be the model of society. Or can we move towards any other kind of?
I think that we are moving towards a more societal sort of communal concept of idea. I mean, even in Canada, we're living in a more socialist nation, where we have more than the U.S.
I would say we're much more greed-oriented.
Yeah, we are greed-oriented, and especially with the conservatives.
It's all about the individual, not the community.
But even there, no. But I mean, the idea though is that when I say Canada, I guess I'm very much thinking of our neighbors down south, the Americans. But okay, look at other, societies like Sweden, look at other societies where you basically sort of are starting to have an idea of people caring for one another to a greater extent. We have the idea of, healthcare access for everybody, education access for everybody. Once we actually start having equal access to resources, well then, how many specific resources your offspring has access to becomes a little bit less important.
Inequality is much higher than it's ever been all around in most developed countries today.
Yeah, but that's because most developed countries focus on an individualistic model rather than a collectivistic model. When you have a collectivistic model, or basically survival of the tribe as opposed to survival of the individual, you actually see a lot less divisions in poverty. Sweden itself, which is sort of my go-to example, they have a very good, socialized healthcare, socialized education, socialized programs. They actually have the lowest Gini coefficient, which for those of you who aren't into economics is the separation between the rich and the poor. So when you have a low coefficient, there's a lot less distinction between the poor and the rich.
Genie?
Is it Genie? I always said a Gini for some reason, but thank you, Genie.
I just want to generalize thoughts on jealousy. So sometimes children will get jealous because their friend has some shiny new toy. Sometimes a person may get jealous because their neighbor has a brand new truck. I think jealousy is based a lot on status, or feelings around status, or feelings of being insecure because someone else has some sort of higher status. Now, and so I think in societies that are potentially more egalitarian or deal with status in a less exclusive way, potentially that also helps to create an environment that's more open to polyamory, which, if you're talking about, for instance, where in which lineage or who's the dad, so to speak, it doesn't matter as much because there isn't a concept of property, or because nobody can determine who the father of the child is.
Yeah. Well, I mean, status still does play a role in, even in sort of collectivistic societies, you're always going to have, to some extent, the concept of status, but who can achieve that status doesn't necessarily become as limited. So, for example, there's a very real problem that we have is that if you're born rich, you have access to more resources. If you're born poor, your chances of ever becoming rich are very small. And they go down, actually, if you're part of a minority group as well. So ultimately, when we stop thinking in terms of individualized behavior and start thinking in collectivistic ideas, we actually see a lot less of that. An interesting idea that you get, too, is one of the current trends towards, for example, school shootings. You see a lot less of those in collectivistic societies than you do in individualistic societies, because basically China is actually a really good example of that. They are considered a collectivistic society. Now, am I saying that we should all switch over to the communist model? Absolutely not. But
China actually had a huge time recently where we actually now people.
really, I actually hadn't heard about that. But I'm not saying it never happens. Okay, that is actually an important distinction. I'm not saying it never happens, but on average it happens less frequently. Yes.
I wonder if your model, the polyamory model, which you're in favor of, somehow assumes that all people, say, if you're talking about a tribal society, that all members of the tribe are equally...
Sorry, can I interrupt your comment? Sorry, guys. I know we want to break up into sort of little group discussions, but just because there's still some people who have some questions that they want everybody to hear, can we hold off until we actually break off before we start having them? We can sort of make it like 2 more questions, and then we can do that. But let's sort of the 2 more questions. And this gentleman over here was actually in the process of asking one.
Sure. I wonder if the polyamory model somehow assumes that we are all equally attractive to each other. That is a bit of a statistical question, and I wonder if you have an answer for that, because just to finish my question, I find it sort of expected that if, say, in a tribe of 50 men and 50 women in an ancient society, that you would find some members of the tribe more attractive personal, physical, or other characteristics than others. And if that is the case, would it be sort of instinctively sort of normal to say that I want to guard people that I like more, rather and protect or keep them for myself?
That's a good question. So just to repeat the question, it's sort of does the polyamory model sort of assume that everybody's attracted to everybody, and wouldn't it be more likely that if you have a group of 50 men and 50 women, that the men and women are going to find only a small percentage of the group attractive, and so will be more likely to try to sort of protect them and gather them to themselves because they like them more? The polyamory model doesn't actually completely exclude the idea of pair bonding. It's just pair bonding doesn't exist along sexual lines. So, for example, I could still say that I prefer, this monkey to any other, or, this ape to any other ape. Sorry, I do occasionally make that mistake. Please feel free to call me on it. So I prefer this ape, but am I just going to sleep with that ape? No, I prefer this ape. I like spending time with him. He's got a great personality, and I like sex with him. But that other ape, he's got a pretty nice thing. And, maybe I want to fool around with him every once in a while. And, that one I want to fool around with him every once in a while. Does it mean you're going to sleep with everybody in the tribe? No, it means you're going to be sleeping with, a small group. Well, not only that, but sex is...
Like more. Simple as that, as much as possible. I think it's somehow, unfortunately, I'm not in favor of the monogamous model necessarily, but I'm saying statistically it's kind of normal to expect that I want to guard or keep people that I like more.
Not necessarily, because... we're assuming that polyamory means you're not keeping that person. In a tribal environment, you're going to keep that person regardless of whether you're sleeping with them or not, because you're going to be constantly interacting with them. So, you don't have to say, no, nobody else gets to sleep with this person because he's mine, because chances are, you'll get to sleep with him as much as you want. But it doesn't mean that you only have to sleep with them, you can sleep with others. And it also doesn't assume universal attraction. There are obviously going to be situations in which there's people in tribe that you're not entirely attracted to. But there'll be enough other people attracted, or other apes attracted to that ape, that they will still get their sexual fulfillment without needing you to sexually fulfill them. And what's more is sex isn't always about attraction. And that's what you see a lot in bonobos, is you get, for example, what we would, you get two females who are performing oral sex on each other, but they're not doing it, because they're necessarily doing it because they're sexually attracted to one another. They're doing it in order to increase bonding. Yes, potentially they could be sexually attracted to one another, but they could also just be trying to create pleasure. Even if you're not attracted to someone, but they're your friend, you want them to experience pleasure. Does it have to be physical pleasure? Not necessarily, but maybe you'll cook them a really nice meal. So there's sort of that assumption that if you're polyamorous, you have to sleep with everyone. And that still sort of comes into our sort of shamed sexual idea, is that idea that, if you're a slut, then you're a slut with everybody, and so it doesn't matter if I fuck you because you clearly can't say no because you're a slut and you give it away for free to everybody. And it's that same idea that sort of comes into that shaming that we've tried to do around sexuality. Sorry. I heard what does, and I'm curious if that was aimed at me or not. Oh, wait, never mind. Sorry, ignore that. Yes?
Just a final comment. If anybody is interested in learning about polyamory or non-monogamy in the context of human relationships, there are 2 books that you should check out. One is called The Ethical Slut, and the other is called Opening Up by Tristan Turnigan.
Sorry, that's a very good point. So for those who might not have heard over here, 2 books, The Ethical Slut and Opening Up. Was it? Opening Up. And I've actually heard of those 2 books. They're really great as well. Also, another great thing, actually, a resource to read that's a lot of fun is, I mentioned Dan Savage, and actually, I forgot to switch my slide. I mentioned Dan Savage, and he's great, actually, in talking about it. And in human polyamorous relationships, the most important idea is communication, which is basically that you always keep in contact. If you have a primary, if you're in a polyamorous model where you're pair bonding with one person, but sort of experiencing sexual non-monogamy or polyamory, that you're keeping in constant communication and contact with your partner to make sure that they're consistently feeling comfortable as well. This isn't about going out and cheating, but this is about mutually sharing sexuality with other people. And I will point out, actually, that a very common but less talked about fetish is actually cuckolding, in which men actually get turned on by the idea of watching another male have sex with their female, which it's funny actually using those terms when talking about human behavior because it sort of dehumanizes a lot of it, but that's not my intent at all. So yes, I just want to sort of wrap up my talk then, and we can sort of break away to discussion groups. My name is Ania Bula. I write a blog. It's at Ania'sWorkInProgress.com. I recently discovered that apparently you actually have to put the www dot in front of it or it doesn't work. I don't know if that's just my computer or everybody's. I also have a YouTube channel where where I'm starting to do more and more video blogs. My username is Ania Onion on that one, and you can also follow me on Twitter at Dear Ania. I'm also going to be a speaker at Eschaton 2012, which is coming up at the end of November, beginning of December. It promises to be a great conference, and I'm not just saying that because I'm biased, and doubly biased because I'm also the publicity officer for CFI Ottawa. I'm saying it because actually there is a great group of speakers coming out. Vicky Garrison, who runs the Quiverfell-free group of blogs, No Longer Quivering is actually the name of it, which talks about women and men who have escaped from the abusive Quiverfell families. There's also Ophelia Benson, who's a wonderful writer and great speaker. Natalie Reid, who's an amazing trans activist and social activist, who's going to be speaking, and I've read some of her stuff. She's brilliant. Ian Cromwell, who talks a lot about race issues, and he's actually from Vancouver. And P.Z. Myers, who I'm sure many of you know of, but if you don't, please check out Free Thought blogs. They're fantastic. And you can check out our website. We have a great feature actually where we do Apocalypse Wens, which is sort of a humorous examination of the various apocalypse scenarios of different religions, written by actually Alexander Gonzalez over there. They're hilarious. And you can also follow Eschaton 2012 on Twitter, and we actually post a lot of really fun articles and also some retweets by our speakers, and post frequently contests for getting discounts on tickets. So please check that out, and please buy a ticket if you can. The conference promises to be a lot of fun, and if you're planning on going, better get your ticket early than later because you never know when it'll sell out. Thanks very much.
To understand, most of these people are not ready to be unplugged. And many of them are so inert, so hopelessly dependent on the system that they will fight to protect it.
I see through it all. I used to believe you, but now I don't need to. I finally see through it all. And since you can't see through the shit that they feed you, then you're gonna be duped through it all. I used to believe you, but now I don't need to. I finally see through it all. And since you can see through the shit that they feed you, then you're gonna be duty.